The morning sun streamed through the large windows of Studio 8H as Whoopi Goldberg adjusted her glasses and shuffled through her notes. The View was preparing for another live broadcast, and today's lineup promised to be particularly interesting. Among the guests scheduled to appear was Sergeant Major William Thompson, a decorated British Royal Guard who had recently returned from a 6-month deployment protecting Buckingham Palace. Thompson sat quietly in the green room, his military posture evident even in civilian clothes. At 62 years old, he carried himself with the dignity that came from 4 decades of service to the crown. His chest bore several ribbons and medals, each telling a story of sacrifice, dedication, and honor. The most prominent among them was the Distinguished Service Order, awarded for his exceptional bravery during a terrorist threat at Windsor Castle 3 years prior. The production team had invited Thompson to discuss his upcoming memoir, Standing Guard, 4 Decades in Service to the Crown. The book detailed his journey from a young recruit to one of the most respected members of the Queen's Guard. Publishers were calling it a rare glimpse into the private world of royal protection, written with the kind of understated dignity that characterized British military tradition. As the show's theme music played, Whoopi took her place at the familiar panel alongside her co-hosts. The studio audience buzzed with anticipation, unaware that they were about to witness a moment that would be replayed countless times across social media and news outlets worldwide. Thompson was introduced as the 3rd guest of the day, following a celebrity chef and a pop star promoting her latest album. When Thompson walked onto the stage, the audience offered polite applause. His bearing was immediately striking, shoulders back head high, every step measured and purposeful. Despite wearing a simple navy suit, he looked every inch the military man he was. The medals on his chest caught the studio lights, creating small flashes of color against the dark fabric. Whoopi welcomed him warmly, asking about his book and his experiences guarding the royal family. Thompson answered with the practiced restraint of someone accustomed to speaking carefully about sensitive matters. He shared amusing anecdotes about tourists trying to make the guards laugh, the physical demands of standing motionless for hours, and the deep sense of honor that came with serving the crown. The conversation flowed smoothly for the first 10 minutes. Thompson spoke about the rigorous training required to become a royal guard, the mental discipline needed to maintain composure under any circumstances, and the brotherhood that existed among those who shared this unique calling. The audience seemed genuinely interested, leaning forward as he described some of the more unusual incidents that had occurred during his watch. But as the interview progressed, something in the studio's atmosphere began to shift. Perhaps it was the casual nature of the talk show format, or maybe the difference in cultural perspectives between American television and British military tradition. Whatever the reason, the conversation was about to take a turn that no one in the studio could have anticipated. Whoopi, known for her quick wit and sometimes irreverent humor, began focusing more on Thompson's medals. She asked about each one, and he explained their significance with quiet pride. The Military Cross for Gallantry in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, the Long Service and Good Conduct Medal for his unblemished record, the Queen's Golden Jubilee Medal, awarded to all serving military personnel in 2002. As Thompson spoke about each decoration, Whoopi's attention seemed to wander slightly. She began making small comments, initially harmless observations about the colorful ribbons and shiny medals. The audience chuckled politely, not sensing any underlying tension. Thompson maintained his professional demeanor, answering each question with the same measured respect he had shown throughout the interview. The studio lights felt warmer now, and Thompson could sense a shift in the room's energy. Years of reading, crowds, and assessing potential threats had given him an almost supernatural ability to detect when a situation was changing. His training kicked in automatically. Posture remained perfect, facial expression neutral, but internally, he was preparing for whatever might come next. Whoopi's co-hosts seemed to sense something as well. They exchanged quick glances, the kind of silent communication that comes from years of working together on live television. The production team in the control room watched their monitors more intently, fingers hovering over buttons that could cut to commercial if needed. Thompson's wife, Margaret, sat in the green room, watching the interview on a small monitor. She had been married to William for 38 years and knew him better than anyone. She could see the subtle signs that others might miss, the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his hands rested just a fraction more firmly on the chairs. Armrests. He was still the picture of military composure, but she knew he was assessing the situation. The interview continued, but the tone was shifting almost imperceptibly. What had started as a respectful conversation about service and sacrifice was beginning to feel different. Whoopi's comments about the medals were becoming more frequent, more pointed. She seemed fascinated by what she clearly viewed as an excessive display of military decorations. Thompson had faced many challenges during his career: angry protesters, potential security threats, diplomatic incidents that required delicate handling. But this was different. He was on unfamiliar ground, in a format where his usual protocols and procedures didn't quite apply. The rules of engagement for a talk show were unlike anything in his military handbook. The audience remained largely unaware of the subtle tension building on stage. To them, this still looked like a normal interview with an interesting guest. But those with experience in live television could feel it. That electric moment when a seemingly routine conversation stands on the precipice of becoming something else entirely. Thompson glanced briefly at the exit, not out of any desire to leave, but as an automatic tactical assessment. It was a habit born from decades of security work, always knowing where the exits were, always having a plan. But he wasn't going anywhere. Whatever was about to happen, he would face it with the same dignity and honor that had defined his entire career. The clock on the studio wall showed they had been talking for nearly 15 minutes. In television time, that meant they were approaching the point where interviews typically began to wind down. But instead of the usual closing questions about future projects or final thoughts, the conversation seemed to be building towards something else entirely. The studio's atmosphere grew thicker as Whoopi leaned forward in her chair, her eyes fixed on the array of medals adorning Thompson's chest. What had started as curiosity was now becoming something more pointed, more theatrical. She gestured toward his decorations with a sweeping motion that seemed to encompass all of them at once. "You know, William," she said, her voice taking on the tone that regular viewers recognized as her setup for a punchline. "I have to ask, and don't take this the wrong way, but don't you think that's a lot of hardware for standing around looking pretty?" The audience laughed, not maliciously, but with the kind of automatic response that comes from years of conditioning to laugh at a host's jokes. But Thompson didn't laugh. His expression remained unchanged, though those who knew him well might have noticed the almost imperceptible straightening of his already perfect posture. Whoopi wasn't finished. Emboldened by the audience's reaction and perhaps misreading Thompson's composed silence as good humor, she pressed on. "I mean, seriously, what do you need all those medals for? Standing still? Not blinking? Come on, help me understand here." The other co-hosts shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Joy Behar glanced at the teleprompter, then at the executive producer in the wings, as if seeking guidance on how to navigate this increasingly awkward territory. Sarah Haynes forced a smile, but her eyes showed concern. This wasn't going according to the planned script. Thompson remained silent for a moment, and in that silence, the weight of 40 years of military service seemed to fill the studio. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, measured, carrying the authority of someone who had learned long ago that true power didn't need to be loud. "May I ask you something, Miss Goldberg?" he said, his British accent making even this simple question sound formal and dignified. Whoopi nodded, perhaps sensing that she had pushed too far, but not yet understanding the gravity of what was about to unfold. "Of course, shoot." Thompson's gaze never wavered from hers. "Have you ever stood watch over something you would die to protect?" The question hung in the air like smoke. The audience, which had been murmuring and chuckling moments before, fell completely silent. Even the crew members, who had seen thousands of hours of live television, found themselves holding their breath. Have you ever spent 18 hours straight in the pouring rain, knowing that your vigilance was all that stood between innocent people and those who would do them harm? Thompson continued, his voice still quiet but gaining an undeniable gravity. Have you ever looked into the eyes of someone planning violence and known that your training, your dedication, Your willingness to sacrifice everything was the only thing stopping them. Whoopi opened her mouth to respond, but Thompson wasn't finished. For the first time since the interview began, he leaned forward slightly, and somehow this small movement made him seem larger, more imposing, despite his age and civilian clothes. "This medal," he said, touching the Distinguished Service Order on his chest, "was awarded because I spent 16 hours lying in a cramped position behind a concrete barrier, watching for a sniper who had threatened to assassinate members of the royal family during a public ceremony. I couldn't move. I couldn't eat. I couldn't even shift my weight without potentially giving away my position." The studio was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. Camera operators found themselves zooming in unconsciously, drawn by the magnetic quality of Thompson's presence. This was no longer a talk show interview. It had become something else entirely. When the shot came, Thompson continued, his eyes never leaving Whoopi's. "It missed its intended target by 3 inches. 3 inches, Miss Goldberg. Do you know why it missed? Because I had been tracking that sniper for 14 hours, and when he finally took his shot, I was ready. My training, my experience, my willingness to lie motionless in my own filth for the better part of a day. That's why it missed." Whoopi's face had changed completely. The theatrical confidence was gone, replaced by something that looked like dawning realization. But Thompson wasn't looking for an apology or acknowledgement. He was simply answering her question with the thoroughness it deserved. "This one," he said, touching another medal, "was for Northern Ireland. 3 months of 18-hour days, knowing that every corner we turned might be our last. Knowing that the children playing in the streets might be used as shields by men who saw violence as a political tool. We lost 4 men during that deployment. 4 good men who left behind wives, and children and parents who still wake up every morning, wishing their sons were coming home." The camera operator working camera 2 later said that he had never seen anything like it in 20 years of television. The lens seemed to capture not just Thompson's words, but the weight of the experiences behind them. Viewers at home found themselves leaning forward, drawn into a narrative they hadn't expected when they tuned in for their morning talk show. "You asked what I need all these medals for," Thompson said, his voice carrying the slightest edge now, though still controlled, still professional. "I didn't ask for them, Miss Goldberg. I didn't stand in formation dreaming of colorful ribbons and shiny metal. These medals were given to me by grateful nations, by commanders who knew what it cost to earn them, by families who understood that their safety came at the price of someone else's sacrifice." He paused, and in that pause, 40 years of military service seemed to crystallize into a single moment of perfect clarity. "So to answer your original question, no, I don't think it's too much hardware for standing around looking pretty, because that's not what we do, Miss Goldberg. We don't stand around looking pretty. We stand ready to die so that others might live. We stand ready to sacrifice everything so that people like you can sit in studios like this and make jokes about things you don't understand." The silence that followed was profound. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the presence of something larger than entertainment, larger than television, larger than the small world of celebrity and commentary that usually filled this space. It was the presence of duty, of sacrifice, of service that asked for nothing in return except the simple recognition that some things were bigger than individual comfort or convenience. The silence stretched on, but Thompson wasn't done. He had spent his entire career speaking only when spoken to, following orders, maintaining the dignified quiet that was expected of a royal guard. But here, on live television, with his service, and the service of his fallen comrades being reduced to a punchline, something had shifted. The man who had spent decades protecting others was now protecting something else, the honor of every soldier who had ever stood watch. "You want to know about standing still and not blinking?" Thompson asked, his voice gaining strength. "Let me tell you about Private James Morrison, 22 years old, who stood his post during the London Bridge attack in 2017. While people were running and screaming, while chaos erupted around him, James stood his ground. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He stood between the attackers and the civilians behind him. The studio remained frozen. Even the production crew had stopped their usual bustling around, focusing entirely on the man who had transformed from a polite interview subject into something far more powerful. James took a knife to the chest that night, Thompson continued, his hand unconsciously moving to his own chest. But he never left his post. Even bleeding, even knowing he might die, he remained at his position until the threat was neutralized. He lived, thank God, but he carries that scar every day. And do you know what he says when people ask him about it? He says he was just doing his job. Whoopi sat completely still. Her earlier bravado evaporated. The other co-hosts had become an audience to something they had never witnessed before. Raw, unfiltered honor speaking truth to casual dismissal. That's what we do, Miss Goldberg. We stand where others cannot. We face what others will not. We carry the weight so that others don't have to. These medals you mock, they represent nights when we didn't sleep so that others could. They represent moments when we chose duty over safety, service over self-preservation. Thompson's voice carried the weight of personal experience, but also something broader. The collective voice of every service member who had ever been misunderstood, every veteran who had ever been reduced to a stereotype, every person who had chosen sacrifice over comfort. I've stood guard in Northern Ireland when bombs were going off every week. I've protected dignitaries who received death threats daily. I've been spat on, cursed at, and threatened by people who saw my uniform as a symbol of oppression rather than protection. But I never wavered because that's not what we're trained to do. The audience was riveted. Many had come expecting light entertainment, celebrity gossip, and the usual mix of humor and politics that characterize daytime television. Instead, they were witnessing something unprecedented. A masterclass in dignity under fire, a demonstration of grace under pressure that was both humbling and inspiring. You asked what I need all these medals for, Thompson said, his hand moving to touch each decoration as he spoke. This one is for Afghanistan, where I spent 8 months watching young men, boys, really, grow into warriors or come home in boxes. This one is for the Falklands, where we fought a war that most people have forgotten, in conditions that would break most civilians in hours. His voice grew quieter but somehow more commanding. The entire studio leaned in as if afraid to miss a single word. This one, he said, touching a small bronze medal, is for excellence in training. Do you know what that means, Miss Goldberg? It means that for 30 years I helped train young soldiers to do what we do. I taught them how to stand still when their feet were screaming in pain. I taught them how to remain alert when they hadn't slept in 2 days. I taught them how to put duty before personal comfort, service before self. The camera caught a tear, forming in the eye of one audience member, an elderly man who wore a small American Legion pin on his jacket lapel. He understood what Thompson was talking about, in a way that perhaps others in the room did not. Every young soldier I trained had to learn the same lesson, Thompson continued, that this job isn't about glory or recognition. It's not about medals or parades or public acknowledgement. It's about being willing to stand between danger and innocence, even when no one is watching, even when no one cares, even when no one understands why it matters. Thompson paused and looked directly into the camera, speaking not just to Whoopi or the studio audience, but to every person watching at home, every veteran who had ever felt misunderstood, every active service member who had ever questioned whether their sacrifice mattered. These medals don't make me special, Miss Goldberg. They make me responsible. Responsible to the memory of those who didn't come home. Responsible to the families who trusted us with their most precious possessions, their sons and daughters. Responsible to a tradition of service that goes back centuries and will continue long after I'm gone. The weight of his words settled over the studio like a heavy blanket. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was education. It was a reminder of things that existed beyond the comfortable bubble of celebrity culture and political commentary. It was a glimpse into a world where people still believed in concepts like duty, honor, and sacrifice. So when you see these medals and ask what they're for, understand that each one represents a choice. A choice to serve rather than be served. A choice to stand rather than run. A choice to protect rather than hide. These aren't decorations, Miss Goldberg. They're reminders. Reminders of who we serve, why we serve, and what we're willing to sacrifice to keep serving. Thompson sat back in his chair, but his posture remained perfect, his dignity intact. He had said what needed to be said, not out of anger or defensiveness, but out of love. Love for his fellow soldiers, love for the institutions he had served, and love for the ideals that had guided his life for 4 decades. The profound silence that followed Thompson's words was broken not by applause, but by something far more powerful. The sound of someone crying. A woman in the 3rd row, perhaps a military mother or veteran herself, had been moved to tears by the raw honesty of what she had just witnessed. Her soft sobs seemed to give permission for others to respond emotionally to what they had just experienced. Whoopi Goldberg, who had built a career on quick wit and never being at a loss for words, sat in complete silence. Her hands, which usually gestured animatedly as she spoke, lay still in her lap. The transformation in her expression was remarkable. What had begun as theatrical confusion had evolved into something that looked like genuine respect, even awe. The show's executive producer, watching from the control room, made a decision that would be discussed in television circles for years to come. Instead of cutting to commercial or trying to lighten the mood, he let the moment breathe. He understood that what was happening on his stage was bigger than entertainment, more important than advertising revenue, more significant than the usual rhythms of daytime television. Thompson, meanwhile, seemed to grow more composed with each passing second. Having said what needed to be said, having honored his fallen comrades and defended his service, he appeared to settle into a kind of peaceful authority. This was a man who had faced down terrorists and assassins, who had stared death in the face and never flinched. A talk show host's misguided humor was hardly his greatest challenge. "Mr. Thompson," Whoopi finally said, her voice noticeably different from the confident tone she had used throughout her career. I owe you an apology. I owe every service member an apology. I spoke without thinking, and I made light of something I clearly don't understand." Thompson nodded slightly, accepting her words with the same dignity he had shown throughout the exchange. "Understanding isn't required, Miss Goldberg," he said quietly. "Respect is." The simplicity of his response somehow made it more powerful. In 6 words, he had distilled a lifetime of military philosophy into something that everyone in the studio, and everyone watching at home, could understand. But Thompson wasn't finished sharing his story. Having opened this door, having allowed the public to see beyond the ceremonial facade of the Royal Guard, he seemed to understand that this moment carried responsibilities. People needed to understand not just what soldiers do, but why they do it. "I want to tell you about the night I earned this medal," he said, touching the Distinguished Service Order again, "not because I'm proud of it, though I am, but because I think people need to understand what happens in the moments when everything goes wrong." The studio remained completely focused on his words, the usual distractions of live television forgotten in the face of genuine storytelling. It was March 15th, 2019. We had received intelligence that someone was planning to assassinate members of the royal family during a public ceremony at Westminster Abbey. The threat was credible, detailed enough that we knew the attacker had inside information, patient enough that we knew they had been planning for months. Thompson's voice took on the measured cadence of someone recounting tactical details, but the emotion underlying his words made it clear that this wasn't just a military briefing. It was the most important day of his professional life. My position was in the gallery overlooking the main floor of the Abbey. I had been there for 6 hours before the ceremony began, checking sightlines, memorizing faces, identifying potential threats. When the royal family arrived, I had already been motionless for so long that my legs had gone numb. The audience was completely absorbed in his narrative. This wasn't the sanitized version of royal protection they saw in movies or read about in magazines. This was the reality, hours of discomfort, vigilance that bordered on paranoia, the constant awareness that a single moment of inattention could result in tragedy. The ceremony proceeded normally for the first hour, Thompson continued. But then I saw him, a man in the 2nd row who matched our intelligence profile. He was wearing a maintenance uniform that looked authentic, but something about his posture was wrong. His hands were positioned in a way that suggested he was carrying something concealed. Thompson paused, and in that pause, the weight of decision-making, under ultimate pressure, seemed to fill the room. Every person listening understood that they were about to hear about a moment when one man's judgment stood between safety and catastrophe. I couldn't move from my position to investigate without potentially exposing myself and compromising the security of the entire venue. But I also couldn't ignore what I was seeing. So I remained perfectly still, tracking his every movement while simultaneously coordinating with my team through hand signals. The technical aspects of what Thompson was describing, the ability to remain motionless while orchestrating complex security responses, began to illustrate exactly why Royal Guards underwent such rigorous training. This wasn't about standing still for tourists. It was about maintaining operational effectiveness under impossible circumstances. For 47 minutes I watched this man. 47 minutes of knowing that he might be planning to kill people I had sworn to protect, while being unable to do anything but observe and prepare. My back was screaming from maintaining position. My eyes were watering from the effort of not blinking. But I never stopped watching. Thompson's account was transforming the studio audience's understanding of what military vigilance actually meant. This wasn't the glamorous world of action movies. It was the grinding, unglamorous reality of professional protection work. When he finally moved, it happened so fast that most people in the Abbey never knew anything was wrong. He stood up during a hymn, reached inside his jacket, and began to pull out what looked like a weapon. I had approximately 2 seconds to make a decision that would affect hundreds of lives. The tension in Thompson's voice was palpable, even though everyone in the studio knew that he had successfully prevented whatever tragedy had been planned. Somehow, his ability to convey the uncertainty and pressure of that moment made the story more compelling, not less. I chose to act. I couldn't shoot without risking civilian casualties, so I did the only thing I could do. I revealed my position and drew his attention to me instead of his intended targets. It meant abandoning my concealment, compromising my tactical advantage, and putting myself directly in the line of fire. But it also meant that whatever happened next would happen to me, not to the people I was protecting. The moment Thompson described his decision to sacrifice his tactical advantage to protect others, something shifted in the studio atmosphere. The audience wasn't just listening to a story anymore. They were experiencing the weight of split-second decisions that carried life-and-death consequences. The comfortable distance between civilian life and military service seemed to dissolve as Thompson continued his account. "The moment I revealed myself, everything changed," Thompson said, his voice carrying the precision of someone who had replayed these events countless times. The suspect's attention shifted to me, which was exactly what I wanted, but it also meant that I was now the primary target of someone who had spent months planning an attack. Whoopi remained motionless, her earlier confidence replaced by rapt attention. The other co-hosts had essentially become part of the audience, their usual role as commentators irrelevant in the face of Thompson's first-hand account of heroism. "What people don't understand about moments like these," Thompson continued, "is that there's no time for fear. Training takes over completely. Everything becomes tactical assessment and immediate action." I could see that he was armed. I could see that he was committed to his plan, and I could see that I had perhaps 3 seconds before he would fire. The studio cameras captured not just Thompson's words, but the subtle physical changes in his demeanor as he recounted the incident. His posture became even more erect, his eyes focused on something beyond the studio walls, as if he were once again assessing threats and calculating responses. I called out to him in the voice we're trained to use, commanding, unmistakable, designed to cut through chaos and demand immediate compliance. "Stop, armed police." But he didn't stop. Instead, he turned the weapon toward me and fired. Several audience members gasped audibly. Even though they knew Thompson had survived, he was, after all, sitting in front of them. The immediacy of his storytelling made the danger feel present and real. The first shot missed me by inches. I could feel the air displacement as the bullet passed my head, but my training held. Instead of flinching or diving for cover, I returned fire with precise, controlled shots aimed at stopping the threat while minimizing risk to civilians. Thompson's account was remarkable not just for its dramatic content, but for the way he told it. There was no bravado, no attempt to make himself sound heroic. Instead, he described his actions with the same professional detachment he might use to explain maintenance procedures or training protocols. The entire incident lasted 11 seconds from the moment I revealed my position until the threat was neutralized. 11 seconds during which hundreds of people's lives hung in the balance. 11 seconds that represented 4 decades of training, preparation, and commitment to duty. The silence that followed was profound. Thompson had taken his audience through not just the events of that day, but through the mindset of someone who chooses to stand between danger and innocence. The medals on his chest were no longer decorative items to be mocked. They were tangible reminders of moments when individual courage had prevented tragedy. The investigation afterward revealed that the attacker had been planning his assault for 8 months, Thompson continued. He had studied security procedures, identified potential vulnerabilities, and chosen that day specifically because he believed he could cause maximum casualties. What he hadn't counted on was that our training, our preparation, our willingness to sacrifice ourselves for others was stronger than his preparation to harm them. Thompson paused and looked directly at Whoopi, then at each of the co-hosts, then at the audience. That's what these medals represent, Miss Goldberg. Not standing around looking pretty, but being prepared to give everything in defense of others. Every Royal Guard, every soldier, every person who chooses service over safety carries the weight of that responsibility every single day. The studio remained completely silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't the awkward quiet that had followed Whoopi's initial comments, but a respectful hush that recognized the gravity of what they had just heard. After the incident, my superiors recommended me for the Distinguished Service Order, not because I was brave. Bravery implies choice, and in that moment there was no choice. I did what I was trained to do, what I had sworn to do, what every person in my position would have done. The medal isn't for me, Miss Goldberg. It's for everyone who stands ready to make that same choice. Thompson's voice grew quieter, more reflective, as he approached the conclusion of his account. You asked earlier what I need all these medals for. Now I think you understand. Each one represents a moment when someone chose duty over safety, service over self-interest, protection over self-preservation. They're not decorations to be admired. They're reminders of the price of freedom, the cost of security, and the value of service. He sat back slightly, his military posture never wavering, his dignity intact throughout the entire exchange. What had begun as a routine interview had become something unprecedented, a masterclass in honor, duty, and the real meaning of military service. I've spent 40 years learning that the heaviest things we carry aren't the medals on our chest or the weapons in our hands, Thompson said, his voice carrying the wisdom of decades of service. The heaviest things we carry are the responsibilities we've accepted, the promises we've made, and the trust that others have placed in us. The audience began to understand that they weren't just listening to one man's story, but to the voice of everyone who had ever chosen service over safety, everyone who had ever stood watch while others slept, everyone who had ever put the welfare of strangers above their own comfort and security. So when you see a soldier, a guard, a police officer, or anyone else who has chosen to serve, remember that their uniform represents more than just a job. It represents a commitment that most people never have to make, the commitment to stand between danger and innocence even when it costs them everything. As Thompson concluded his powerful account, the studio seemed to exist in a bubble outside of normal time. The show's executive producer, watching from the control room, made another unprecedented decision. Instead of rushing Thompson off stage, to make room for the next segment, he extended the interview. This was television history in the making, and he knew it. Mr. Thompson, Whoopi said, her voice still carrying the weight of everything she had just learned. Before you go, I have to ask, what do you want people to take away from this conversation? Thompson considered the question carefully, as he seemed to consider everything carefully. When he spoke, his words carried the authority of someone who had spent 4 decades thinking about duty, service, and sacrifice. I want people to understand that freedom isn't free. he said simply. The safety you feel when you walk down the street, the security you feel in your homes, the confidence you have in your institutions, none of that happens by accident. It exists because people you'll never meet have chosen to dedicate their lives to protecting it. He paused, his eyes moving across the studio audience, taking in faces that represented the very people he had spent his career protecting. I also want people to understand that service comes in many forms. You don't have to wear a uniform to serve. You don't have to carry a weapon to protect others. Teachers serve. Firefighters serve. Doctors and nurses serve. Anyone who puts the welfare of others before their own comfort is serving. The camera operator working the main shot later said that Thompson seemed to grow larger as he spoke. Not physically, but in presence. This was a man who understood his place in something bigger than himself, and that understanding gave him a kind of quiet power that was impossible to ignore. But most importantly, Thompson continued, I want people to remember that the freedoms we enjoy today were purchased with the blood and sacrifice of people who came before us. Every generation has its guardians, people who stand between civilization and chaos. We do it not for glory or recognition, but because it's necessary. Whoopi nodded slowly, clearly still processing everything she had heard. And what about those of us who haven't served? How do we honor that sacrifice? Thompson's answer was immediate, as if he had been waiting his entire career for someone to ask exactly that question. Live worthy lives, he said without hesitation. Use the freedom that others died to give you. Be kind to each other. Look after your neighbors. Raise good children. Build strong communities. The greatest honor you can give to those who serve is to make their sacrifice worthwhile by creating a society worth protecting. The simplicity of his answer made it profound. In a world of complex political debates and philosophical arguments, Thompson had reduced the essence of citizenship to its most basic elements: kindness, responsibility, and community. As the interview drew to a close, something remarkable happened. The studio audience began to stand, one person at a time, until everyone in the room was on their feet. It wasn't planned or orchestrated. It was a spontaneous gesture of respect that seemed to surprise even Thompson. He stood as well, his military, bearing evident even in civilian clothes, and nodded his thanks to the audience. But then he did something that no one expected. He saluted. Not the crisp, formal salute of a ceremony, but the respectful acknowledgement of one person who serves to all the others who serve in their own ways. Thank you for listening, he said simply, and thank you for caring. As Thompson left the stage, the studio remained standing. The usual post-interview chatter was absent. People seemed to understand that they had witnessed something special, something that deserved a moment of quiet reflection. In the days that followed, the interview would be viewed millions of times online. It would be shared across social media, platforms discussed in coffee shops and classrooms, and referenced in speeches by politicians and military leaders. But for those who were in the studio that day, the most powerful moment wasn't captured by any camera or microphone. It was the moment when Sergeant Major William Thompson, decorated Royal Guard and defender of the Crown, walked off the stage with the same quiet dignity he had carried onto it. He had defended not just his own service, but the service of everyone who had ever chosen duty over comfort, sacrifice over safety. He had reminded an entire audience that behind every uniform, every medal, every ceremony, there were real people making real sacrifices for the benefit of others. And he had done it not with anger or defensiveness, but with the patient grace of someone who understood that education, not confrontation, was the path to understanding. As the show went to commercial break, Whoopi Goldberg sat in her chair, still processing what had just happened. She had started the day thinking she would interview a retired soldier about his book. Instead, she had received a master class in honor, dignity, and the true meaning of service. The last shot of the segment showed Thompson's empty chair, his medals having caught the studio lights one final time. But by then, everyone understood that those medals weren't decorations or ornaments. They were reminders of the price of peace, the cost of freedom, and the value of having people willing to pay both. usual rhythms of television production, the need to move quickly from segment to segment, the pressure to maintain audience attention, the commercial breaks that punctuated every show, all seemed irrelevant in the face of what had just occurred. Whoopi Goldberg, who had spent decades mastering the art of television conversation, found herself in completely unfamiliar territory. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a humility that surprised even her longtime colleagues. "Mr. Thompson," she said slowly, "I came into this interview thinking I was meeting someone who stood around looking decorative. I'm leaving it having met one of the most impressive human beings I've ever had the privilege to speak with." The audience erupted in spontaneous applause, but it wasn't the polite, routine clapping that typically marked the end of television interviews. This was genuine appreciation, the kind of recognition that comes when people witness something authentic and profound. Thompson accepted the applause with the same dignified composure he had shown throughout the interview. He nodded slightly to acknowledge the audience's response, but his expression remained humble, almost uncomfortable with the attention. This was a man who had spent his entire career in the background, protecting others while remaining largely invisible himself. "I don't deserve applause for doing my job," Thompson said when the clapping subsided, "but I accept it on behalf of every service member who has ever been misunderstood, every veteran who has ever been ignored, and every active soldier who continues to stand watch while others sleep safely." The other co-hosts, who had been largely silent observers to this extraordinary exchange, began to find their voices. Joy Behar, known for her quick wit and sharp commentary, spoke with unusual thoughtfulness. "I think all of us here and everyone watching at home owes you and everyone who serves a debt of gratitude that we can never fully repay," she said. "Your story has reminded us that there are people out there making sacrifices we can't even imagine so that we can live the comfortable lives we take for granted." Sarah Haynes nodded in agreement. "What strikes me most is your humility. Even after everything you've shared with us, you don't see yourself as a hero. But that might be exactly what makes you one." Thompson shifted slightly in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with being labeled a hero. "Heroes don't come home, Miss Haynes," he said quietly. "Heroes are the ones who made the ultimate sacrifice. I'm just a soldier who was lucky enough to serve alongside heroes." This simple statement seemed to encapsulate everything that made Thompson's presence so commanding. In an age of self-promotion and celebrity culture, here was a man who had genuinely risked his life for others, yet refused to accept credit for his actions. The